ready?
Yep.
Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to the summit. My name's Jeff Elza. Most of you guys already know me. There's a few new, actually I think I might know most everybody here. So I'm here to talk about Traffic Router, Tomcat 8.5, and TLS. And the big disappointment is only a couple of slides are similar from my Apache talk. So if you guys want to talk about that towards the end of that, we can go ahead and do that. So, happy Hacktober, everybody. I wanted to kind of tell you guys we're having some fun on our team. The pumpkin on the left, that was carved up by Jesse Rivas, who is sitting over there. And then on the right, you will notice there is, that's very hard to see from over here. Jan would be yelling at me about my contrast. You can see there's a traffic control logo on that coffee cup. Yesterday, Jeff Bevel hacked our coffee machine. Basically, there's a compact flash card, and he figured out how they do their checksum, and we now can completely hack our coffee maker, which is pretty sweet. And we did it, really subtly, so hopefully this lasts for a while. All right, so getting into this, why Tomcat 8.5? So basically, Traffic Router, for the longest time, since I first joined this team, was on, which is 5 years ago now, it was on Tomcat 6.0.3.3, which is very, very old. And it used, I think, the Java crypto extensions. It's whatever the internal crypto API is inside of the JDK, the JRE, that's what they were using to do TLS. So with Tomcat 8.5, they've chosen to provide many more options for how to do SSL, one of which was the one that we chose, which is to use OpenSSL natively using Tomcat native with APR and all of that native goodness that comes along with it. That also comes along with 8.5 is additional improvements to the connectors that we use. We had used the BIO connector or the blocking IO connector, which obviously the B word is not good. If other Traffic Router people here recall, we had a fairly significant issue with the 6.0.3.3 NIO connector, and we never really revisited that, so we were like, okay, just go back to BIO. And the performance was awful. I mean, between BIO and the native, or the JDK native, I would say, inside the JDK, that crypto, between those two things, it was just terrible. Performance-wise. And then, of course, the other reason is this gets us closer to the bleeding edge. Tomcat 8.5, when we made this decision, was basically the newest that you could possibly get, and gets us closer to current instead of further away, so then we can respond quicker to CVEs, security threats, things like that. And also, it gives us the ability to work with the community on code that's recent, instead of saying, hey, Tomcat people, we're seeing this really weird thing with the NIO connector on this 10-year-old version of Tomcat, please help us out. They'll say no, upgrade, and we'll say we can't. So that's why we went with Tomcat 8.5, basically.
Is Tomcat 8.5 delayed, or do they already have something new?
They have a 9.0, and they're focusing a lot on H2, it sounds like, in 9.0. 8.5 was supposed to be 9.0, I think, at some point, but they were like, well, we're putting too much in it. There's a bunch of confusion.
It was like there was this 9.0 branch that was going, and then it got like in this really bad state. That was like so they kind of went back to 8, ported over the things that they wanted from 9 and made 8.5. But since then, they sorted out the 9.0. That's why we went 8.5 a year.
It seemed like 9 was too big of a cut from.
Yeah. So 8.5 to 9.
And it doesn't seem like you get a lot of bang for the buck on Traffic Router with
No, because I mean, we could run this inside of a standalone JVM if we wanted to. And in fact, Trevor Ackerman wanted us to do that back in the day.
I think he did a POC on that.
Yeah. So there's really no reason to do it. The main reason to stick with Tomcat 8.5, and maybe I should have put that on why Tomcat 8.5 as well. The main reason that we chose to stick with it was because they supported OpenSSL. If they didn't support that, we would have chosen a different container or taken a different approach.
I guess Tomcat 9 may do, what's that called, right? The SSL with 0 RTT, whatever? TLS 1.3? Yeah. Does it support TLS 1.3? And that may be something, if
I would
people
imagine
are coming
so.
back to the same traffic router, then they would have a faster connection, right?
Well, if you've had a connection before with
Yeah.
TLS, what we can resume that session in either 0 or tier 1 or T.
Yeah,
The client and the server support.
clearly I don't know as much as Leif does about this, but
I'm just thinking, why would we be on the bleeding edge of Tomcat if they include TLS 1 or OpenSSL 1.1, you get TLS 1.3, I think, and then you can do fancy shit.
yeah,
We should look at that.
we definitely want the fancy shit option.
Yeah, we want the fancy shit.
All right, so how did we get to Tomcat 8.5? Maybe I should have had these kind of reversed, but you know, for those of you that kind of are new or weren't part of this, there are a lot of new people on this team. Our team at Comcast has exploded growth-wise, so it's kind of crazy. So basically, we went to ApacheCon last year, and we saw, hey, they've got all of these great talks about TLS, and I guess that's a miss on our part for not being more plugged into the Tomcat community up to that point, to be aware of what they were working on, to know that this was coming. But be that as it may, it is what it is, and we showed up there and we were like, wow, these guys really have their stuff together, and they're finally addressing all of these terrible complaints that we've had about the TLS performance in Tomcat. So then we stalked Mark Thomas, me and Dave Newman. We stalked Mark Thomas and kind of pinned him down and said, hey, we've got this really funky use case where we've got a DNS server running inside of Tomcat. And that really kind of made his eyes go like big, and he's like, what are you doing? And so we explained it to him, and he actually kind of got excited because it seemed like a wacky use case. At least this is my, seeing it from his view, I think he might have said, well, this is kind of a strange use case, but it's a lot of scale, so I want to support these guys. So he hacked up some benchmarks for us. While Nithya Ruff, who's the director of open source engagement, I think, at Comcast, was doing a keynote. While she was keynoting, Mark Thomas was hacking for us, creating some benchmarks, and afterwards, he was able to provide those results to us to basically give us the confidence that we needed to select Tomcat as the container for the future, Tomcat 8.5. So basically, immediately after that, Newman started development on the new version of our custom key store, which I will be getting into in the next slide to explain why we do that. And basically, it took us about, I don't know, probably 6 months or so to get the dev work done. But we had some breaks in there, and then there was a lot of testing, and then we had some really interesting clients get lit up on the CDN at Comcast that really increased the amount of traffic that was being sent to Tomcat and our traffic router essentially. And in order to mitigate that, I'm always a fan, much to SRE's chagrin sometimes, of failing forward. So I said, well, we got this Tomcat 8.5 build and traffic router 3.0, and it's really fast, so let's try that. So we put it in over this summer, basically when we were running around with our hair on fire a little bit, and it all worked out great, except for a couple of caveats. So roughly, based on some benchmarking, what we saw was that it was a 1 to 2 order of magnitude performance increase. Dude did most of that benchmarking. I did some of it before he came along. And this isn't 1 to 2 orders of magnitude in the positive direction. It's kind of 1 order of magnitude better, period. And Tomcat 6033 was so terrible, it was sometimes an order of magnitude worse. So I'm netting that as a two order of magnitude gain, because we would go from, like, for example, 30 transactions per second in the really bad scenario on Tomcat 6033 to 3,000. And yes, that is a big improvement. It's still not really where we want to be, but it's certainly a lot better than where we were. So for the new people and people that aren't as familiar with Traffic Router in particular, so we have this thing that's a custom key manager. So typically when you run a Java application, you have to deal with the Java key store, CA certs file, all of these annoying things that basically say, oh, well, you have to run this key tool command and import the certificate into your key store, and then you have to restart your container and blah, 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 blah. Well, that is terrible if you're trying to run a CDN that always has to be on. So we basically took a look at their source code, figured out how all of their TLS stuff works, how they pull certificates out of the key store that's static, and more specifically, how are they doing this with OpenSSL, because you can now use standard like PIM format OpenSSL certificates that you could never use with a Java application before, but you can now with Tomcat because of the OpenSSL support. So we had to basically reverse engineer all of that. Newman started that process, and then we have a contractor named Andy that kind of took that over the finish line and figured that out. So what that means is you can generate your stuff in traffic ops and just hit, save, and magically it just percolates all the way down. So that's no different than what we did in Tomcat 6033, but that is specifically why it was so difficult for us to get from Tomcat 6 to Tomcat 8.5, which I'll touch on with some lessons learned here in a bit. I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, no changes in terms of the APIs that we hit. They're all the same as 6033 previously.
Yeah, so the one thing we did do as part of that, I think it was part of that, maybe it was in remember the, I'm looking specifically at you, Mike, remember the, that really bad memory leak we had and then
Yeah, it wasn't a memory leak, it was a connection leak.
connection leak,
Yeah.
All that's gone. Like,
Yeah.
that code is actually out of the code base.
Yeah, that's right, because we had a custom BIO and a custom NIO connector,
Right.
and the NIO connector is the one that had the leak in it, and that has been
Raising the
eliminated.
standard openness. So
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
so that's a big improvement.
But
And
it's still a non-blocking,
non-blocking.
yeah,
but it's just a different
It's
implementation.
OpenSSL now.
It's OpenSSL, okay.
right. And like I said on the prior slide, I think we are currently in production on this today, fully, 100%.
Okay.
Okay, so packaging, for now, we are on RPM and CentOS 7X. We never tested this on CentOS 6, so Steve, upgrade your stuff. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I felt like I wanted to pick on you since everyone else has been picking on you too.
This stuff not upgraded. Yeah.
No, so this, it probably works on CentOS 7 or 6. It's probably no big deal, but just be aware this is fully systemd enabled now. We ripped out all the init stuff. So if you wanted to run this on CentOS 6, good luck, have fun. We build the RPM for Tomcat. When we package all of the software, we grab it from their website and unpackage it, and we build it using our own spec file at that time. So the reason that we did that was if you go search the internet, there's about 50 billion different Tomcat spec files with varying licenses and yada, yada, yada. So we didn't really want to get into that game. We kind of had some aborted attempts in that direction, and I finally said, no, let's just start our own. So we wrote our own spec file for it. I mean, spec files are really simple. This is not that big of a deal. But it is nice to have that package so you guys, as users, don't have to figure out where to get Tomcat, which version to get, and what lives where, more importantly. And that's because Andy spent a bunch of time figuring out how we can have a base install of Tomcat over here in one location, yet all of our config files can live under the traffic router directory in the config directory where everything should live. And that's how it is in the new version.
So do you have your own kind of fork of the Tomcat source code?
No.
When you build it, so you just go out and pull it and then build it every time you
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we have inside the POM, if you're a developer of Traffic Router, we've got an embedded Tomcat that has a specific version that should match, I haven't checked, but it should match what we're pulling down and building. So as you're developing and testing your code, if you're running the integration tests, you're also doing that through the embedded Tomcat 8.5 server, which means all of our subclasses and basically all of our extensions that we've done on top of Tomcat will also be tested at that time, and that includes our SSL implementation.
And this is done now because it used to be the old one. It would be on Traffic Router RPM installation. It would try to go out to the internet and get Tomcat.
Yeah,
which
that's
grained up. Yeah, okay.
that
So what all happens
terrible,
is
nasty, embarrassing hack is gone. That was like one of my least favorite things that I never spent time to fix for all the years I was on this team. So Andy finally did fix it. Only happens at build time.
Okay.
When you install it, it will be static. You don't have to have internet connectivity or any of that stuff like you did previously.
All right, cool.
It does depend on, as I mentioned before, Tomcat native and APR, and this is so we can plug into OpenSSL and use native socket stuff for performance. The systemd configuration, this was a little bit new for us, and perhaps this is just us in our new knowledge of, or maybe even my knowledge of systemd and how it works, but the traditional tuning of etc security limits.d, throw a conf file in there and say number of open files is a billion. You can't do that, at least it didn't work for us here, so we had to do that through systemd, and we've got a new config file called startup.properties that sits in the traffic router conf directory. If you need to change file descriptors, things like that, all of the tuning now should take place in the conf directory, essentially, instead of having to go hunt and peck throughout the system configs and the Tomcat configs and all that. It should all just be in that directory. Yes, there are multiple files. Server.xml is one of those files. Startup.properties, we've got a couple other app properties files that need to be tuned, but they're all at least in one spot now, which is a lot nicer. How am I doing on time? I'm doing all right. All right, so this is what the config file looks like. It looks very similar to what it used to look like. What I have highlighted in red here is the custom implementation that we have now, the custom SSL implementation. Thankfully, the Tomcat development team rocks. They are very, very, very good at writing configurable applications. I say this because we've got this option SSL implementation name that's available to us under a connector, but also because we've got these things that are in yellow. These are actually, the first two are the same thing. The second one is client auth equals false. The first one is actually very controversial, and I will be touching on that in a couple of slides. But basically, you shouldn't have to configure this. There's some, the connection timeout and max thread stuff you may want to touch, but other than that, this is all fairly standard traffic router config, and it should just replace what you have. You can also see down at the bottom, the last line, that's where you see the NIO protocol. So we do subclass it, but I don't think that we do a bunch of...
I think there's one method over there.
Yeah, it's just the delayed start, essentially. We're not doing all the other stuff that we used to do with those connectors. All right, so tuning, this is all standard stuff. Basically, we set a large-ish minimum heap value for the JVM, and then we give it a bunch of memory. We're running on systems that, in some cases, have 256 gigs of RAM, so we set a large heap size. We use a G1 garbage collector. That was a lot less invasive in our testing, so that's what we went with. We've been on that one for a while, though. That, I think, went in with 6033 with the first implementation, but we're still using it with this implementation of the custom SSL stuff. Again, tuning is via sysctl and system D. Sysctl would just be the normal stuff, TCP stuff that you need to tune the kernel basically on your Linux box. Tomcat and application timeouts and thread pools have also been tuned to an extent. The defaults are reasonable, but your mileage may vary. You may need to make some adjustments, so be aware of that. In terms of performance, I didn't want to put a lot of, I know this is probably killing engineers that want to see data. I didn't want to put a lot of data in here because, to be frank, I'm not entirely thrilled with all of the numbers, even though they're totally sufficient for what we need to do. So I would like to see us improve performance further before we start bragging about the numbers. But basically, I did some splunking around yesterday and found that roughly 5% of our traffic that we do 302 redirects on at Traffic Router today is TLS, which is not all that much. So in terms of the ratio, based off of how Comcast is deployed right now, back of the napkin math that I did yesterday, we would still be an order of magnitude off per traffic router for what it can handle based off of the hardware we have, based off of the performance numbers that I know. So even if we flipped everything over to TLS today and went 100%, I think we would still be okay. So even though I'm not, wanting to brag about all the numbers, I think, it's still, for what we need to do, it's still totally acceptable because, you're in and out of traffic routers so fast. If you can get them out, then you're good. So I went over the worst case improvement. That was because 30 transactions per second is terrible with Tomcat 6, and yeah. So when we did the load testing, we were definitely able to 100% soak every single core on that machine. So we are definitely able to do that without any problem now. I think if we wanted to make further improvements, we're either going to have to adopt some of the new TLS stuff or scour for inefficiencies within the code, which I'm sure they exist. So perhaps we could handle even more by, fixing a couple slow algorithms, essentially. All right, so the controversy, going into the lessons learned. So of course, stay as current as possible. That's like, thanks, Captain Obvious. Going from Tomcat 6 to Tomcat 8.5 was difficult. pain in the butt. And if we had just been whittling away at that over time, we wouldn't have been in the situation that we were, which was basically we had no bridge to get from A to B. And they were like, hey, Tomcat community, we're EOLing Tomcat 6, you better upgrade. And we said, oh, well, we can't. You're going to EOL this before we can get done. They EOL'd it like last summer, I think, right after ApacheCon. And it was only because we had to do all that custom development. So if we stay as current as possible, then we chip away at it and we don't have to worry about this. So I think in the future, we have to keep a better eye on what's going on in the Tomcat community, at least for as long as we're using it as our web container. The controversy is actually, so there's this guy, Remy something or other, he works for Red Hat, I think he's out of Montreal, and he's a full-time Tomcat guy, essentially. He's doing a bunch of work on H2 in Tomcat, and he is the person that is responsible for us not having our reason phrases in our 302s. So certain clients look for that. I guess I skipped over the client auth one. I'll get to that.
The reason phrase?
The reason phrase is like 302 blah blah.
302 redirect.
200 okay.
200 okay. 404 not found. The reason
The not found.
that follows the numeric code. So
So by
they've
default, it just says
taken
200.
they've taken a hardline stance as far as I'm concerned, which is it's optional per the RFCs. You shouldn't be relying on it, and in H2 it just doesn't exist. So they're like, F it, we're taking it out.
Yeah.
And so when we saw that doesn't work, we had multiple clients, video clients that are, splitting or looking, they split this numeric side and then word side, and then they're trying to match up the word on the right. I mean, it's an idiotic thing to do, but you can't stop people from being idiots, right?
saw this with a load balancer.
Right, yeah, we as CDM people know that we have to deal with the entire world of stupid clients out there.
And origins.
And we have, and origins.
We had this happen with a load balancer upstream of us, where it's like they took away the word, and then the load balancer started marking everything down.
Yeah. It's just people assume that it's there, and there's no sort of standard about what the wording is.
Yeah.
And so when we upgraded from 6033 to 8.5, we first dropped the reason phrase entirely because they made it a default that was turned off. Then when we've turned it on, the wording had changed. So it didn't say 302 move temporarily, it said 302 something or other. So there's no consistency and no standards there. So never should you be relying on it. It doesn't stop people from changing it. And I think, I won't say which clients broke. So there is a vendor of a mobile platform that is a little more fragile than the other ones from what we've seen. So the other big surprise was this client auth equals true is a default setting that's turned on from what we can see or from what we experience. And so it's not really a great experience when you go into the Xfinity Stream app and you go to hit play on your video and then it's like, hey, what client cert do you want to use? And they're like, WTF? Like, what? I already logged in. And so we were like, WTF, this doesn't make any sense. And at the time, we only had one upgraded traffic router. So we had all of our non-upgraded traffic routers that were normal. And then we had one guy that was doing the weird stuff. So it made it even more hard to troubleshoot. Because, of course, at the time, we had no idea the reason phrases were gone, that client auth was enabled by default. We didn't know. So we just went to prod like that. Surprise! And also the speaking of that, the fragile mobile platform, this one was actually our fault. We had this thing called the player platform, and we kind of wrap around all of the myriad of different video players that could be out there for Android or iOS or our own video players that Comcast developed. So when you send a content type, you can put a semicolon on there, and you can say ISO 9660 whatever encoding. Broke clients. So if you have a semicolon there and other stuff, apparently some clients break. So again, going back to Tomcat giving us options, being good developers, you should always program configurability into your software, especially if it's traffic control. But they do that too. So we were able to basically configure ourselves out of this situation and into a good situation.
So back to the Remy guy, right? Did he say that in the next release they're going to deprecate this entirely? And when we brought that up, he was like, "Oh wow, maybe we should reconsider it."
Well, there was that guy that was like super understanding. So there's there were several Tomcat developers that were there, And this guy was kind of like, I think he was on our side, thinking
Yeah.
that the other guy was crazy with his opinion. And so he basically saw my talk and then went and ran and talked to that guy.
Chris. Chris?
No, it was there was Remy and then Jean Pierre, I think was the other one.
Yeah.
So anyway, ran to him and was like, see, this is why we shouldn't do this. But the guy still got his opinion, so it doesn't really matter. And if we did want to change it, of course, we could go to their mailing list and start badgering the heck out of them. But now that we know that we've got the configuration option, it's really not that big of a deal.
But also,
Test that stuff.
It will be in 9 though if it's gone completely, because it is going to be gone in 9.
Staying in touch with the community.
What's that?
Staying in touch so you can see.
Yeah, I mean, we need to do that in general, and so that's kind of this kind of got shrunk down text size wise, so I apologize. This is my last slide, so I'm going to be shutting up. We can talk about anything else after this, but so basically the next steps from here, one of the problems that we have in traffic ops is, at least in traffic routers specifically, we only support RSA certificates right now. And so they're not the fastest certificates that we could be using. So we need to add support for other certificates. The elliptic curve certificates seem to perform better. And ATS supports a bunch of different certs, so we should too. And Tomcat does too. It's just that our custom key store and the way that we do things in traffic ops, we need to integrate all of that stuff together. Collaborate more with the Tomcat project. That is not just limited to following the user list, but it also means talking to them about maybe onboarding what we call the language connector, that concept of a delayed start. They have something that's somewhat similar, but because we basically take over the entire server, our use case is a little bit more than what they do. So Chris, he's one of the main dudes in the Tomcat community. He was like super interested and was like, hey, so we've got something that's similar. Do you think if we did this, that, and the other, then it would get you what you need? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I want to sit down and like think a little bit before you ask me a bunch of questions. So, but at the end of the day, he was receptive to work with us to put that connector back into Tomcat and potentially create a more pluggable framework for us to plug into, such that we can get out of the business of maintaining all of this custom TLS implementation code on our side and put that on the Tomcat side for them to worry about. And then maybe we've just got a little shim that integrates our traffic vault and traffic ops, key API with traffic router. And then maybe we just deliver that data to this API and then magic happens. I don't know what that looks like, but if we want it to happen, we have to invest time with that community specifically to make it happen. Another thing that I've been wanting to do is decouple HTTP and DNS. There are scaling reasons why we need to do this. So if we just dropped a capability onto the content router object in the CR config that said what they were able to do, we could then say, oh, well, this guy, he's only an HTTP traffic router, or he's only a DNS traffic router, so build your topology accordingly. And then if we added the ability to assign delivery services to traffic routers, then you could have a lot more granularity in what you're doing.
Yeah, I think decouple DNS and HTTP and maybe even decouple some of our components a little bit more. I think there are some people that would be interested to use traffic router and maybe just traffic router. And right now you walk up to this whole monster and you got to do all this stuff and CR-config.json and all that good stuff. Maybe have like a limited implementation or a more basic implementation that you can use them standalone.
Yeah, I think a big part of that, much like what we need to do on the ATS side in terms of the integration with traffic control, is we need to create a more, which you Apple guys are hopefully going to help us with, is a more generic way to describe our config files. We also need to do that with traffic router too, exactly. And then we should be able to do that. And that also plays into this second to last item here.
But not just config, also health information and because maybe I don't like traffic monitor and I have my own health system, but I still want to use traffic router.
I mean, the API, the format is so open, you could put whatever you want in there.
But simple is better, and CR config is not simple.
Yeah, and the CR states API, while it's simple, it may not be the best way to encapsulate everything that we need to encapsulate. So, but also TLS is like super required. Hang on the phone real quick. TLS is super required. So it's hard if you don't have certs, for example, to just get this up and running. And so you have to kind of know, oh, well, I got to go create a self-signed certificate, or traffic router doesn't even start up. That doesn't matter for most of us that already have TLS installed, but it's not great walking into the project cold. So we need to work on those little quirks and installability issues. as well, which helps us run it standalone.
Yes?
Yeah, question on the phone.
Just I experiment a bit with the decoupling of the DNS router and HTTP routers. And indeed you can do it just by playing a bit with the CRP feed, letting only some kind of part of the routers get into the be published as DNS in the TR record, and connect only the other part of the router to the DNS resolver. I played with it and it seemed working. So there's no real, I'm not sure if that's what you were saying, but there's no need to separate the code.
No, the separation I think is more. There's two things I think that need to happen. There's one, the kind of Dion's point is we need to make sure that this thing can eventually be able to run standalone without having to have the rest of the traffic control beast connected to it. And then also decouple the DNS and HTTP sides simply to give the operator more options in terms of how they want to build things out. Right now, you're required to run the DNS and the HTTP stuff no matter what. And I don't like that you're required to do that, and then also that you can't do any sort of assignments to traffic routers as well. That causes problems with DNS answer sizes, for example, things like that. So I don't know that they're specifically related, but the one may help out the other. I do agree, though, with what you're saying, that by default, we're pretty close to being able to do this already, I think.
And one additional comment on that. Traffic routers practically have three roles. Okay, it's being an HTTP router, it's being a DNS router, and it is also a static name server for the HTTP router.
Right.
So you might even want to separate it into three components, because there's a very static, stupid component, and there's the more intelligent components that actually do routing.
Yeah, I agree. I think, at a certain point, we need to step back and stop just slapping stuff onto the side of traffic router and probably, work on a serious re-architecture effort, because I feel like we're digging ourselves deeper into some certain holes that we need to kind of like pull ourselves out of those holes and move to the side and then figure out, maybe we want to build a different house. I think we can take a lot of the code and ideas that we've already, established, but maybe apply them slightly differently and get rid of some of the cruft that we have. And I think maybe even switching to a different language should be on the table at that point too.
I was just going to ask you, you don't even mention that.
Well, yeah, I didn't want to go to. So half of this deck came from Apache Con, so I didn't want to go onto the Tomcat track and be like, oh yeah, in a year we're gonna just replace this with a Golang app or whatever. I don't know that it would be Golang, but
Try to this stepping back and re-architecting. Try to not do that in Tomcat only, but in the open source community.
yeah, if and when we get to that point, it will not be a Comcast effort. It will be a traffic control effort, and we will be discussing our goals, design goals, architecture, all that stuff openly in the community.
And maybe we should try some of those things that ATS community does sometimes, where we pick a topic and we get a couple of people together for a couple of days and work on it from different companies.
Yeah, I think that would be good, and I think that would help us, build the community and stuff.
Working groups.
Yeah. Make them open, right? Anybody can come, but you'll end up having mostly the right people coming out. And
Yeah, for sure. Because I think one of the things that I know a lot of other CDN vendors or CDN operators still rely on is Akka DNS. I would love for you guys to not use Akka DNS, for example. So if we can provide a component that stops people from using Akka DNS, then we've got one more community member that can help us build better software and improve our software. The one last thing that I do want to mention for everybody, so this is not just in Jeff's brain, we have to move to OpenJDK because Oracle jacked up their JDK licensing. And so basically if you use the Oracle JDK, you could be on the hook commercially, liability-wise, down the road once Larry Ellison decides he's got his tentacles deep enough into you. So as far as I'm concerned, it should work fine in OpenJDK. I'm guessing Steve's probably already run it in production on OpenJDK.
Talk about it.
Yeah, so I mean, so it's, I think just basically we're going to have to update the dependency in the POM file to point to OpenJDK instead of JDK, just regular JDK. So it's not a big deal. We just have to get people to start testing it. So if you have the ability to test traffic router, if you can do this, if you can help us do this, it would help the whole community and project out immensely. It's low difficulty work. Really all we need to do is make sure that it starts up, that it builds, that it compiles, that everything does what it's supposed to do. And any references to the JDK get eradicated from our code base. So everything build and runtime should both be OpenJDK.
Should be agent.
It's currently JDK 8. That's everything that we've tested against, but you know, the way that Java works, it could be 1.9, 1.10. I wouldn't be all that concerned about compatibility issues. We're not using any sort of super old constructs, and then anything that's new that we're using is only up till 1.8 anyway.
Changing CDN in the box to use JDK instead, because right now Oracle is blocking it.
Yeah, so maybe this is the impetus that we need to make that change.
Hey, Jeff,
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
have you given any thought to routing traffic to solve for content hashing using DNS routing?
Yes, we have, and I can't talk about all of those things because it's an expensive problem to solve. And depending on how you solve it, you can save your company a lot of money. And we have some good ideas in that direction.
Okay. Couple little add-ons to that. Have you thought at all about popularity-based caching and serving off of different tiers directly to end-user clients?
Different tiers? No. But popularity, yes, and serving off of different parts of the network based on what that content is, also yes. So for example, the use case would be if in a metropolitan area, if you had a metropolitan network that was more for your business, and then you had like, you know, backbone connection, you could serve content off those backbone caches only, and then all your other content you could serve just from your regular corporate or whatever kind of local municipal network that you wanted to.
I was thinking more about like maybe machines geared for higher end content and popular content versus, let's say, like lower end machines geared for long tail library type content.
The hardware mix is an important detail. The most important part of it, at least from my perspective, is the architecture. As long as the architecture is flexible enough, then we can achieve those things that you're talking about. That is one of the things that we want to be able to do, I think, is to be able to route differently based on the class of machine that you're on. And so Rollin is working on a concept right now called flexible cache groups, and that's going to go into traffic router and traffic ops, traffic control in general. That's going to help with some of this stuff. How like we at Comcast choose to leverage that, you know, that's going to depend on our goals and what we have and what we need to do.
One clarification, I was under the impression that if you set your DNS answers to 2 and you have 8 caches in the cache pool, you're always going to get the 2 same IP addresses back based on consistent caching in the hostnet. Is that not true?
That is correct if you have a setting set to true. I'd have to check to see what the default is, but there's a feature, a config level, basically a top level config object attribute called use consistent DNS routing, and that's what that gives you. So for example, though, I would love to take that setting and pull that setting and client subnet extensions, both of those features down a level. Because right now it's all or nothing. So either you do this across your entire CDN or not. Client subnet extensions across the entire CDN or not. I would like to make that decision based on delivery service. For example, EAS. You haven't forgotten your Comcast stuff. So we use consistent DNS routing in that case. And for EAS, if we set that to 10, it's always the same 10 servers until we get a health event, and a health event on a 5-second TTL is kind of madness anyway. So if I could turn that feature off on that, then we would shuffle across the entire cache group and give us that breadth that we want and distribute it, because we've got multiple caching resolvers sitting behind that Anycast BIP on, per CRAN. That would give us exactly what we need, and it would help for that scale. But if we turned it off, then we start affecting all the other DNS delivery services where we actually need it more critically. So that would be something I would want to put on the future roadmap. And then same for the client subnet extensions, because you don't necessarily want to give people the power to bypass geo restrictions that are being enforced on Traffic Router, because if you stood up your own caching resolver that had client subnet extensions enabled, you could then send your queries through there, and you could basically mimic any IP you wanted to that way. So I would only want to put that on certain delivery services where that's not a problem, for example. No.
So if you're running a cloud DNS, if you're running a DNS, you can always do that.
It's just, if I send a traffic router a DNS packet and I say, I've got this client subnet extension, and here's my subnet, traffic router is just going to say, oh, I see this extension, I'm using this IP, and boom, defeated. Which is why never do your content security on traffic router.
So we've got a feature that I believe is planned to be open sourced for doing geo-blocking on the caches.
Yes.
And I'm going to cover that in my slides eventually. But that uses, I might botch this, that uses actually the direct, because you can also, if you pass in a certain header for HTTP delivery services.
Maximum client IP, same thing.
Yeah. That doesn't work when you do it on the edge. It uses the actual IP, which was kind of a nightmare for testing. But
if you guys were able to open source that, you would be my heroes, because we've been talking about working on that for ages, and we just have not had the time.
It's fairly complicated. I'm kind of, the slides are in process, but I'll present it. So,
cool.
Yeah.
Like an ATS plugin, right?
Yeah, it's a modification to an ATS plugin. The plugin is open source already, but the modification we still need to open source.
Did you guys add the VPN stuff as well?
Autonomous proxy?
Blocking of node proxies.
That I thought was open source already.
That's
I was actually going to ask that.
Traffic router. Do we
That's
have
a traffic router thing, but
do we have an ATS plugin to do that?
Yeah.
It'll go. I'm going to cover this, but it goes through. It actually uses the traffic router geo-blocking logic.
Give your whole talk right now, man.
Yeah,
The whole thing.
All the details.
You're up.
Yeah, because my slides are totes already.
I'll talk about it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm glad there will be questions though. So because I don't know how I'm going to fill 45 minutes.
So then real quick, I already kind of mentioned this, but thanks to Newman for starting this up, Andy for finishing it, and Dwayne for helping out with the load testing stuff.
Couple more things though. I didn't see, there's no talk on traffic monitor, is that Newman?
I can answer traffic monitor. What do you want to know about traffic monitor?
Can we do a quick state of traffic monitor? Like, is anybody still?
The state of traffic monitor.
No.
Wait, okay, let me start over. I have to remove the snarkiness. So recently at Comcast, we got killed by several Step 1s, and they weren't related. Well, we've had some less than optimal experiences recently. Some of them resulted in Step 1s, some of them resulted in gray failures that were not necessarily detected as a Step 1 or as an impacting event, but when you lose all your traffic monitors for 4 hours in the middle of the night because OpenStack goes away and they don't reconnect and you're blind.
Is this
and
Go?
that's not good. Yeah, that's Go.
I'm not stay on the line virtualization.
The OpenStack is anyway, but the Golang, the
Golang.
traffic monitoring Golang, yeah. So anyway, so because we've been moving a little too fast and breaking too many things, we kind of got slapped, and so we had to slow down. And so
is this something I should be worried about? Like,
no, I'm talking just hang on.
okay.
This is I'm telling you the story of where we got to where we are now. So basically, we got told to slow down, stop breaking so much stuff, and so we're doing that. And so we decided for at least one sprint, we were going to slow down and we were going to start working on stability efforts. And we were going to look at every single component, regardless of whether or not they were involved in a Step 1 or not. So one of the things was traffic monitor, and and Evan and John Rushford can speak to more specifics because they were the two that were assigned to this effort. But basically, we had two classes of things to look into with Traffic Monitor. One was negative test use cases. So traffic ops is down. What happens when you start Traffic Monitor? Well, right now, it totally doesn't work right. It tries once and then walks away. So we've got a PR open to fix that. And they've walked through a lot of those less than optimal situations so that we don't have that problem.
We ran into that.
Yeah, it's embarrassing, to be frank. We should not have software that we've been running in production that for this long that has these glaring holes in it in terms of approach. And then the other, hang on, Hank, the other bucket is performance. Evan looked more closely at performance, and there were two for loops that
we ran into
were
that.
roughly 30-35% of total CPU time.
Stat summary.
I don't know exactly which functions they were,
I
but
think-
we basically have like, what did you say it was? Oh, Venda third or something like
I
that?
think it was in the third.
Yeah, or no, 4. I think it's 4 nested 4. We ran into that too.
So I think that one is an obvious area where we can hopefully fix the performance problems that everybody's been griping about. Unfortunately, if you've got all of your data for all of your polling stored in an array or list data structure, that's kind of how you have to get to the data. So I think what we should probably do is kind of like traffic router, but I don't think it's nearly as bad. Step back a little bit, say, how are we doing this currently? How do we have all of this data stored internally? Why is it that we're having to iterate this way? Why is it that we're spending 35% of our time right here? And maybe we can trade space for CPU time, essentially. And yeah, maybe we have to use 4 times the amount of RAM to make this thing work, but maybe it doesn't use 32 cores at 100% or whatever it is, you know? And then in addition to that, we've been having problems because of the number of caches that we have to poll is now causing that polling deadline to kind of creep outward. And we want that to stop because it's got, you know, you've got this exponential algorithm that's running and it is not going to get any better. It's just going to get slower and slower and slower and slower.
Steve, are you on Java still?
Hank, you were going to say something.
Just because of that.
So
Hank, did you have a question?
No, a comment.
Yeah.
One of the things I ran into when I was testing Traffic Monitor is that if you have a cache that's set to online, but it is actually down.
Yeah.
Traffic Monitor never finishes starting.
I don't know if John and Evan have found that particular one.
online or
There is also
reported.
reported.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that specific one is fixed.
I thought
It
that one was fixed.
It may be, but
might be worth retesting.
And this is Go, right?
Yes, this is Go. So if you guys have things like that are happening, it would probably be worth it to, you know, maybe we can get this PR merge that they've opened up first, but maybe get a retest on some of these scenarios just to confirm, you know, because obviously we're going to be trying to find these, but if you know of specific ones, test it out, let us know if it's still a problem, and we can get that on the list to fix.
I also know that we filed an issue if you have a profile in a CDN that does not include a help polling URL parameter, then it will fail to come up.
Yeah.
I think that one is another one that's in the pipeline.
But that comes in by default usually, right?
Unless you make a new server profile from scratch.
Okay.
And then forgot.
And
I mean,
forgot that was a required parameter.
You need to have the
Okay.
polling URL in order to poll.
Right.
That should not prevent all of the other things that already have polling URLs from being polled. You know, it's silly.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, we're long story short, we got ourselves into some hot water. We're working on some stability efforts that should hopefully improve the software for the rest of the community. It would be great if we could get a little bit of help doing some testing, and if you want to help write code too, that would be even better. But testing is welcome too. So I think I am maybe right at time. That worked out pretty good. Any other questions? Comments? Concerns? Negative? All right. Thank you.